studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. The question, what are public schools for? Oh, I know the answer.
Yeah, what?
They're to train kids to be political activists for the left. That's what they're for. Isn't that right?
Oh, they tried to get that conservative group at Taft High School, and they shot that down. Oh, I shouldn't use that word. Excuse me. They didn't let that happen.
That's the purpose of K through 12 education, is to set kids on a path to be political activists for the left, and then codify that path when they go off to college, isn't it? Well, Oren Cass over at American Compass, where he's the executive director, surveyed parents, and interesting the responses of what parents think their government schools are for versus what those in charge of the government schools think they're for. To share some of those results with us, pleased to be joined now by Oren Cass. Oren, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Well, we know from Miguel Cardona, the Secretary of Education, that parents are one of the stakeholders in K through 12 education, one of the important people in the education of their children. Not the primary. Wouldn't say the primary. What do parents think as to their role? Do they think they're the primary stakeholder in their kids' education? Or do they relegate themselves to just being another stakeholder, as the Secretary of Education suggested?
It's funny you ask that. We didn't even bother to ask parents that question in our survey because it strikes me, at least, as so obvious that parents, of course, in addition to being a primary stakeholder in this, also probably know an awful lot about what they and their families and their kids need, and so even if parents said, "Oh, don't mind us, we'll sit here in the corner," yeah. I would hope that the public education system would say, "No, you know your kids better than anyone. Please do tell us what you're looking for." And so our survey was all about asking, okay, what do you think the purposes of public education should be, and how are we doing on those things?
And what did parents say? What's the primary purpose of their kids' schooling from their perspective?
Well, it's funny, you sort of in the intro raised obviously the issue that I think is politically in focus right now, which is this question of sort of indoctrination and critical race theory and so forth. And so we did ask parents that. We gave them a choice. We said, here are two things public education could be focusing on. It could be focusing on emphasizing America's history and accomplishments and instilling a common set of civic values and a shared American identity, or it could be emphasizing our ideas and failures, or our failures, and encouraging students to discover their own values and identities. And unsurprisingly, parents much preferred the focus on America's history and accomplishments and finding a shared identity and shared values. But I think, what they felt even more strongly about, and I think, we all really need to kind of think about and look more broadly than just these political fights about things like critical race theory, is what are we actually trying to teach kids? What do we want them to accomplish? And I think, a lot of people assume the goal is sort of maximize everybody's academic potential, get everybody into the best possible college. And when we ask parents, is that what you want, or do you think it's more important to help kids develop the skills and values that they need to build decent lives in their own communities? Parents overwhelmingly chose that. They chose build decent lives in their own communities over the maximize academics and get into the best possible college. And so I think that, especially as we think about, how do we make our schools great, that's maybe the place we need to be focusing the most.
But the American parents that you spoke with had children between the ages of 12 and 30? Why 30? I mean, doesn't that seem a little old?
Well, we wanted to focus on people who had the most recent experience with the education system and had sort of seen how it actually worked out. So I'm the parent of young children, but I would say honestly, I have, as a result, I really have less experience with the schools and seeing how public education works than somebody who has seen, whose kid is 28, which means they actually, in the last couple of decades, saw their kid go all the way through the schools, saw if they went to college, saw what that happened as they started out on their adult life. And so that's really whose opinion we wanted to ask, both because we thought they would have the best perspective and because we would also know what ended up happening for their own kids. So, one thing that's really interesting is, you might think, well, parents whose kids had a great time in college and, set off on successful careers, surely they at least will say that, they think that's what public schools are for. But it's not. Whether their own kids succeeded in college or living the American dream, or dropped out of college and are struggling to get by, everybody still agrees that the purpose of public education is about building decent lives in your communities, not about getting into a great college.
Yeah, and the other thing that it provides is some perspective on changing attitudes or maybe changing experiences, because I think a lot of people will suggest, if they've gone back, that the school they went to 10 or 20 or certainly 30 years ago is very different than the school as it exists today.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think if you kind of look at what has happened with education reform, a generation ago, everyone had this idea, well, let's kind of get everybody into college. And, look, at the time, maybe that wasn't such a dumb idea. I mean, 100 years ago, we'd said, well, let's get everybody into high school. and that worked really well. So you could say, yeah, let's get everyone into college is the logical next step. What I think has happened is that we tried that and it didn't work. Today, one thing that's important to realize is very few people actually go successfully from high school to college to career. You're much more likely to never even go to college or to drop out of college or end up, with a job that didn't require a college degree. And so I think everybody in their own life now knows people, whether it's friends from high school, whether it's their own kids or neighbors. They've seen that this doesn't work for everybody. And so that, that doesn't mean, therefore, we should shut down all the colleges, although certainly they need some work. But it does mean that we should be investing at least as much effort in providing alternatives, in saying, we put just as many resources, just as much attention to other pathways to good lives. Instead, what we do now, which is sort of say, well, if you don't get into a good college and succeed, then that's sort of your fault and you're a loser.
Hmm. And you note in your piece, distilling this survey data, that the disconnect between what administrators and teachers know and want for their students versus what parents know and want about their kids is really important, because some of the au courant principles by which so many of the teachers and administrators live turn out to be very damaging to those ends.
Yeah, I think if you look at who really sort of runs the education system, who you would call the, quote, education experts, it tends to be very highly educated progressives. And one thing we found in our survey is that very highly educated progressives have different views than everybody else. They tend to have different aspirations for themselves and their children, and they tend to, they've had different experiences. They are the ones who sort of most benefited from pursuing the college, not just high school and college, but then, graduate degrees and now making their careers in this little world. And so, I think there are plenty of things for which you want the input of education experts, but you also have to recognize the bubble that they're in and the ways that their views aren't representative. And so, I think maybe the single finding that was most striking to me is we asked parents about the idea of tracking, which means, in high schools having different paths and saying some kids are on the college track and are going to be in the college prep courses, and other kids aren't, and they're going to be headed in a different direction, and that, means in a lot of cases maybe they should be in different courses. And educators, professional educators and progressive generally say, oh, that's terrible. That doesn't align with their sense of equity. If you ask parents, they say that's what they want by more than 6-1. It was 85% say, yes, please do tracking in high school. And yet that's something that our reformers have been running away from for a generation. And so I think that really underscores the extent to which, some of these ideas of equity, and you have New York City getting rid of its gifted and talented programs. You have California suggesting there's no such thing as gifted. Honestly, I think most of the people saying these things, I'll say I think they're well-meaning, but they're wrong. And what they're doing in their attempt to benefit everybody is actually hurting everybody. And so putting parents in the front seat, not just on some of these specific questions around things like critical race theory, but really in understanding kids, in knowing what they and their families need and are going to help them build good lives, I think that's really where we need to focus to improve our public education system.
Well, and the other piece of this, too, in terms of that disconnect that you're describing, is, part of it, I think, is parents, and historically we've seen school as a place to form common values, to come together as a people. And I mean, of course, I understand the history of segregation and so on and so forth. In fact, unfortunately, we're reliving the history of segregation from a different angle right now because of these progressives. I mean, you literally have segregation by race for student assemblies and so forth at recess in schools. It's crazy. And I think when parents see that in the 21st century, they're like, what are we doing? I thought we fought those civil rights fights, and the promise of Brown versus Board of Education was to end a racial order and to bring people from different backgrounds together to build and to understand societal norms in a free society and their responsibilities and their rights. And now we're turning back the clock. So it's ironic that the people who call themselves progressives are turning back the clock.
I think that's really well put, and it speaks to something that I think people have really forgotten about. Going all the way back to Brown versus Board of Ed, we remember that segregation was wrong because the schools for African Americans were worse. They were being treated unfairly in that respect. But it's important to keep in mind that Brown versus Board of Ed considered the question of separate but equal. That is, even if the schools for the different races were all just as good as each other, Brown versus Board of Ed says you still can't do that. And that gets to something I think really important in what public education is for, which is it's not just about, what's going to generate the highest test scores. It's about what are the common values that we are conveying to our next generation that are going to allow us to function as a democracy. And segregation is obviously a terrible value to be conveying. And so part of desegregation wasn't about, we think this is going to improve test scores. It was about this is who we are as Americans and what public education is going to teach about values. And so I really think, exactly to your point, we've now flipped that on its head, and we're again conveying exactly the wrong set of values, a set that's so corrosive to our democracy. And we really have to embrace the idea that part of what public education is for is building a common vocabulary and set of values and civic beliefs. And if we don't do that, I worry about how long the country can really survive and function.
He is Oren Cass. He's the executive director of American Compass. You can check out the survey results that his organization did. PC published at City Journal, city-journal.org. Oren, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560.
Merry Christmas, you filthy animal.
The Answer.
Oh, yeah. Hey, guys, this Christmas, give her the next best thing to wearing nothing at all. with silk, soft, naturally nude pajamas available exclusively at pajamagram.com. Sensuous and smooth, naturally nude pajamas feels just like her soft skin. Even more alluring than lingerie, the texture and touch of these pajamas is so seductive that you'll both love the feel of them. Leave nothing to the imagination with naturally nude pajamas. She'll love the feeling of wearing next to nothing at all, and best of all, Pajamagram does the wrapping for you for free. In a year filled with the unexpected, get her something she can count on. Plus, they're backed up by a 100% lifetime guarantee. No risk, just pure luxury. Here's what you do. Go to pajamagram.com, pajamagram.com to order naturally nude pajamas and tell them Dan and Amy sent you. Oh, yeah.
It's that time of year again. Open enrollment for individual medical coverage